Welcome everyone to the Community IT Innovators webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about file sharing servers to cloud. Just a few tips before we get started with the webinar. We encourage you to ask questions. You can ask questions using the chat function or the question functionality. We will also be sharing a few polls with you, so you're welcome to respond to those. And if possible, try to avoid multitasking. Just a little bit about Community IT Innovators. We're very excited to announce that we will be launching our new website starting tomorrow, and you'll start seeing our new branding as well. We partner with nonprofits to help them solve their strategic and day-to-day IT challenges. And if you're in the DC and Maryland area, please feel free to contact us if we can help you. Now I want to turn it over to Johan Hammerstrom, who is our speaker for today.
All right. Thank you very much, Roshni. And thank you, everyone, for attending. It's great to see so many people out there. And I think we have a really nice presentation in store for you today. So as Roshni mentioned, our presentation is on files, file storage, server to cloud. And I think file storage on servers is something that most of us are familiar with. So I'm assuming that most of you are here because you want to hear a little bit more about file storage in the cloud. So I want to start actually by talking a little bit about some of those information systems that we're already used to seeing in the cloud. What are some of the things that we're comfortable with being in the cloud already? Email is obviously one of the big ones. I think email is something that we could say has been in the cloud for at least the last 5 to 7 years. And in fact, most of the smaller organizations that we work with, organizations with, say, less than 25 staff, have had their email in the cloud for quite some time, either generally with some sort of hosted exchange service or with Google Apps. So email is a system that, it's an information system that we're very comfortable thinking of as going into the cloud, and there are some very clear industry leaders when it comes to email being in the cloud. Accounting packages, especially for smaller organizations, there are a certain number of accounting packages that can be utilized in the cloud. And I think QuickBooks Online is one of the most common ones, but there are others as well. And along those lines, fundraising systems have also really moved wholesale, for the most part, into a cloud-based environment, especially for smaller organizations. And I think eTapestry was one of the early ones, all the way back in 2004, I think, that started to do all of the storage basically in a cloud-based environment. CRMs, also very popular. Constituent relationship management systems can be stored in the cloud, again, generally for smaller organizations. Although that caveat is starting to disappear as, in our experience, more and more larger organizations, with more than 45 or 50 staff, start to migrate a lot of their data out into a cloud-based environment, particularly into what we call the public cloud. And obviously, communications systems are another type of information system that generally lives out in the cloud. But not, I think, one of the systems that you'll find missing from that list are files. There are a variety of cloud-based options for storing files, but there is not an industry leader when it comes to cloud-based file storage. And I think the fact that there are so many of you attending this webinar today is kind of a testament to the fact that there's still a great deal of cloud-based file storage that's up in the air. We're not really sure where it's going to go. And that raises the question, why not? Why is cloud-based file storage something that has not taken hold to the same degree that particularly email has? Now, before we get into that, we want to conduct a few polls here, just kind of get a sense of who's in our audience today. So let's go ahead and run the first poll, Roshni. So if you could just look at your GoToWebinar screen. Just let us know how many staff are in your organization. Got the numbers coming in here. Great. We are at about 70%, almost complete voting. Great. Oh, we got a really nice mix. We have about a third of the attendees have less than 10 staff or less. Another third between 21 and 50, and then the remaining third are for organizations that are either between 11 and 20 or over 50 staff. So we have a really nice mix of attendees there, and I think you'll find that this webinar is really you're going to find something useful for your organization, regardless of how large or small you are. So it's great that we have a wide array of organization sizes in the audience today. We also want to go on with our second poll, and that is just a yes or no question. Is your organization, not you personally, but is your organization currently storing files in the cloud? All right, that is great. Thanks, big thanks to everyone who's voting. It's about 50-50. I would say the exact numbers are 45% of the organizations of the attendees there, and we have about 54 in attendance right now, aren't storing any files in the cloud. 53% are storing some, and only 2%, which I think is just one organization in attendance, is storing all of their files in the cloud right now. And I think that really, I think if we were to ask the same poll, we're not going to do this, but if we were to ask the same question of email, we would see, much more dramatic numbers of the number of organizations that are storing their email in the cloud. And now one third poll here before we move on with the presentation. For those of you who are storing some or all of your files in the cloud, is that official? Is that something that your organization has kind of rolled out in an official way, or is it, the employees who store files in Dropbox so that they can access them in their personal Dropbox account so they can access them easily at home? We've got about half of the attendees voted, and it's pretty split. It's about let's see. It's about 60% of the attendees are using an official, sort of the organization has set up an official way for them to store, and then 38% are unofficial. And I think that's actually probably doing better than the industry. I think you'd probably find in the industry it's reversed in the other direction, where you have unofficial cloud-based file storage tends to be the norm in most organizations. And this is true not just in the nonprofit sector, but throughout government business, throughout the enterprise, the world of enterprise. So it raises a really interesting question. Why not? Why has file storage not been as readily migrated out to the cloud as some of the other information systems that we talked about? And I don't want to point fingers, but I think the reality of the situation is that it's due largely to the dominance of Microsoft Office, and particularly to a philosophy that Microsoft developed around its information systems. It really took hold in the late 90s, but I think it's kind of at the core of Microsoft's overall corporate strategy. And that's this idea of what I like to call sort of a walled-in garden. So if you have Microsoft Office and you're using that to edit, Office documents, then chances are you need to have a Microsoft Windows workstation. And if you have a Microsoft Windows workstation, you want to store your files on a Microsoft server. That's all running on a Microsoft-based domain. Even just 5 or 6 years ago, you generally had a Microsoft Exchange server. You were probably running a database on a Microsoft SQL database server. And this is really Microsoft's vision for enterprise IT over the last 15 years, where if one piece of the puzzle was a Microsoft-based system, then in general, every part of it had to be Microsoft-based. So if you were using Office to edit documents, then the natural way to use those documents was to store them on a file server, which you were accessing through Windows Explorer, which was running on your Windows workstation. And it's sort of this end-to-end, the holistic nature of file editing and file storage, particularly rooted in Microsoft Office, that has really made it difficult for cloud-based file sharing and storage solutions to take hold. Because if you disrupt any one part of that chain, you're kind of disrupting the whole chain as a whole. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The problem, though, and I think the more that people start to use cloud-based services for their other information systems, such as email, other kinds of databases, they start to realize that there are a lot of limitations with this system, with the Microsoft-dominated system that has been in place for the last, 15 to 20 years. What are some of those limitations? First and foremost, one of the great things about cloud is that you can use it remotely. So, and I think, the Dropbox analogy I alluded to earlier is probably one of the most common situations for organizations, and it's because the typical Microsoft file server is difficult to access remotely. There are a lot of ways to get around that. You could use a terminal server, you could use a VPN, but none of them are very elegant, and particularly in this day and age, none of them are nearly as easy to use as the wide variety of remote access methods that now are available to us through cloud, mobile devices, and so forth. So using files remotely is very difficult. There are platform restrictions. I think one of the biggest challenges for people using iPads these days is editing documents. There are some editors that you can use on the iPad. Apple has iPad versions of Pages and some of the other productivity suite applications. There are third-party options such as Quick Office and Office Suite Pro and Documents to Go, but none of them work great. None of them integrate seamlessly. And Microsoft, who's said that they're going to develop Office for the iPad, hasn't done that yet. So to some degree, if you're using Microsoft Office, there are some restrictions in what platform you can use to edit, view, and modify those documents. Extending that even further, there's just a limited mobile presence. Basically, if you have a file, Word or Excel spreadsheet on your file server at your office, it's basically trapped there. And there's really no easy way for you to get it on your cell phone, on your iPad, on some other mobile device. So that's a big challenge. They're generally more difficult to collaborate with. Microsoft has added a variety of collaboration features over the last 10, 15 years of the life of the Office suite. So their reviewing and markup tools are very good. You can add comments, and there's some versioning that can be done. But in general, the Office document and the Microsoft Windows file server don't lend themselves to collaboration, and they certainly don't lend themselves to collaboration in real time. And again, this is something that we're starting to expect more and more in our computing environment because of the ability to do that with other types of systems. And then finally, it requires an in-house investment. I think one of the big reasons that we've encouraged, especially our smaller clients, to move towards cloud-based email hosting over the last 5 to 10 years is that, if you have less than 20 staff, it's a lot less expensive to pay a monthly fee for, a hosted solution than it is to buy a file server every 3 to 5 years, pay the money to get it deployed, pay for its upkeep, pay for its maintenance. It's just a more significant in-house investment for an email server if you want to have that in-house. Now, the calculus is a little bit different for larger organizations, but that's certainly a major factor for smaller organizations. However, most of these organizations are still investing in a server because they need that for the domain, they need that for the file server, so it does require an in-house investment. So we want to do another poll. We're really curious to hear from all of you if any of these challenges resonate with you. So if you could just kind of look over the challenges and limitations to the current approach to the file servers, what challenges do you face? And I think this is a multiple answer question. You can answer multiple times. We'll wait here for those to come in. And let's see, I think we've got a question here. So, great question. How am I defining cloud versus server storage? So, and I apologize if this question was from earlier and I'm just getting to it. Basically, server I'm defining as in-house, so it's a local, either on-premise server, or it could even be, a server that you're hosting at a colo facility. And cloud is basically, a publicly available service that you can subscribe to, where you're storing your information at one or more data centers that's owned and managed by another company. I hope that answered the question. There's another question, will this presentation cover hybrid storage? I think that it will, but if I don't get to that, we'll definitely have time during the Q&A at the end, and I'd be happy to touch on that more. So returning to our poll, about 70% of the respondents found the difficulty in remote access to be one of the major limitations or challenges of the current file storage environment. So that was the #1 challenge. #2, about half of you said difficulty in collaboration, and another half said they're requiring an in-house investment. About 40% said that the limited mobile presence was a challenge. Only 33%, a third, said that the platform restrictions were a problem. So I think the difficulty in using remotely is definitely one of the main challenges. So I'd like to show you a slide that describes the future of computing in the cloud as Microsoft would like to see it. And I really don't want this to come off as an anti-Microsoft presentation. That's certainly not my goal. We are, in fact, a Microsoft Silver partner here at Community IT Innovators, and we've been using Microsoft technology for, for our 20 years that we've been around. And I'm delivering this presentation to you today on PowerPoint because I think it's a great solution for presentations. But I do think that the environment has changed dramatically over the last 5 years. And without wanting to be overly critical of Microsoft, I also think it's important for us to be, aware as IT professionals of where the industry is headed. So this slide here, I think, represents what Microsoft. Now, I had mentioned earlier that Microsoft's strategy was kind of an end-to-end, a holistic ecosystem where Microsoft really controls every aspect of it. And that's what they've had up until now, where they've controlled, the desktop operating system, the server operating system, the email operating system, the clients that access all of that information. That's really Microsoft's goal. And I think if you took that strategy and, moved it, fast forward 5, 10 years to the IT environment that we now have, you get something that looks like this diagram. And I think the goal for Microsoft is that you would have, Windows machines, whether it's Windows Phone, the Surface tablet, or a regular, Windows 8 workstation, or the Xbox is, part of that now. That's the hardware that you're running. And you're using that hardware to access music through Zune, or apps and other electronic commodities through the Windows market. You're using Bing for search, Yammer for your social networking, and Office 365 and SkyDrive for your cloud computing. Now I think as you look at this, some parts of this graph are pretty clear and make sense, but other parts are kind of like, wait, Yammer, SOCL, what's that? I've never heard of that. And that right there kind of shows you what's happened to Microsoft's dominance over the last 5 years. Because the reality is we don't live in the world that Microsoft would like us to live in. We live in this world as far as IT goes, where social media is dominated by Facebook and Twitter. Mobile devices are really dominated by Apple and Android. I think Windows Phone, which has gotten rave reviews, has about 3% of the market share right now. So as great a product as it might be, the delays that a company that's released kind of led to it being poorly adopted thus far. iTunes and Amazon are kind of the major brokers of electronic information in the commercial space, and Google obviously is probably one of the definitely a lot more, has like 70 or 80% share of the search space compared to Bing and some of the other offerings. So this is the reality of the IT sector at this point. It's become a lot more diverse and heterogeneous than it was just 5 years ago. And it's also very consumer-driven, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of this presentation. But the fact that it's consumer-driven has also changed things. So, 10 years ago, back in 2003, the enterprise was defined by enterprise-driven technology, which was largely brought to us by Microsoft. 10 years later, at the forefront of IT is really defined by the consumer space and by a wide variety of companies, not just one company. And so how does this affect cloud computing? Well, the challenge is the fact that cloud computing is kind of a wide open space at this point. So you don't, whereas the space has sort of been defined by Apple and Google and Amazon and Facebook in some of these other areas, it really is wide open right now in terms of what's going to happen with the file sharing and file storage in the cloud. And so I want to spend some time in this webinar talking about some of these different solutions because they're very, very different. The SharePoint, it's not just a question of, which is going to meet your needs best, whether it's, SharePoint or Ignite or Google Apps. They're all very different solutions, and they're trying to tackle this problem in very different ways. And I think it's important to understand how they're trying to tackle the problem. So here, I'm not going to talk so much today about Dropbox or SugarSync. They're trying to find ways to break into the enterprise, but they tend to be sort of consumer-based solutions that are focused more on the consumer. SkyDrive is, for some reason, Microsoft has kind of split its file sharing into two different platforms. And one is SharePoint, which is geared towards the enterprise. The other is SkyDrive, which is geared towards the consumer space. And I think they're trying to, bring them back together and unify them, but they work in very different ways. So I'm going to talk at first about SharePoint. I'm going to talk about Ignite, which is a solution that we've actually been rolling out a fair amount over the last year or so. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Box, Evernote, and Google Apps, which at first glance, particularly Evernote, you might think, file sharing, that's not really what Evernote does, which is true. It doesn't. It's not a file storage or sharing solution. But you'll find, I think, when we get to the end of this webinar that it's really pertinent to our discussion. So let's start by talking a little bit about SharePoint. SharePoint has been around for a long time. I think it's been around for 13 or 14 years. And it's a collaboration solution that Microsoft has been working very hard over the years to deploy. And I think, for those of you who've experienced and worked with SharePoint before, in situations where it was well planned, where the deployment was well thought out, it's actually been a very successful solution. And we have a few organizations that we work with that are still using SharePoint deployments from 8 years ago that are kind of central to how the organization shares information. The problem is a lot of IT departments did not take the time and care necessary to roll out SharePoint well. And I think it's hard not to go to a conference or some kind of a presentation on IT and not hear some SharePoint horror story from somebody where they spent a lot of money trying to roll out SharePoint and then it was never fully adopted by the organization. So it's, SharePoint is still an option, and particularly for nonprofits who have access to deep discounts on Office 365, they have the ability to access and use SharePoint in that cloud-based environment, in Microsoft's Office 365 environment. but it still requires the same sort of care and planning that it always has. And I think one of the reasons that SharePoint never really replaced the file server, or hasn't yet, is that it requires a lot more overhead to use. You have to upload documents, you have to download documents, check them in, check them out. It's just a more labor-intensive solution than your traditional file server, where you have a shortcut to the file on your desktop, you click on it, open it, you start working on it right away. SharePoint doesn't work that way at all. Now Microsoft is trying to overcome that limitation, and they released something in Office 2010 called SharePoint Workspaces, which synchronizes we lost sound. Okay. Okay. So that kind of leads me to the next solution that I want to discuss, which is really more of a hybrid solution. And that's exactly what Ignite is. And so Ignite is kind of literally, physically trying to bridge this gap between the on-premise file server that everyone knows and loves and the cloud-based file server that we all are, looking towards in the future and are hoping will be there. So if you look at, this is just a diagram from their website, and you'll see that Ignite, basically the structure is that you have a network attached storage device, or a NAS, and a NAS is basically, many of you may have those in your office already. They're great for storing really large files, video files, and it's basically a hard drive with a network card. And you can set up file shares on the NAS. You can navigate to it just like you would a file server, and it's less expensive to operate and deploy than your traditional file server. So the Ignite system basically will synchronize with a NAS that you have at your office. So if you have, let's say, 8 workstations at your office, you can deploy a NAS device, set up your files on it, and share those files out using a map drive, using a file share, just like you would a traditional file server. You can access the files, edit them, and really, for anybody in the office, it looks like a traditional file server. What they don't realize, or what they may not realize, is that on the back end, that NAS device is also synchronizing all of those files with the file server cloud. So if you open up a proposal that you're working on the NAS device and save it, and then go home at night, you can actually access that same proposal through the cloud server. If you have a document that you want to share with somebody outside of the organization, you can send them a secure web link to that document, and they can access it through the cloud-based file server. Yeah. So thank you for that question. A NAS device, NAS just stands for Network Attached Storage. And it's basically it's a file share that you can put on your local network. It's like a hard drive with a network card on it. You can share files out from it. But it doesn't really have an operating system the way that a full-blown server would. The other nice thing about Ignite is that you also have the ability to access all of those files from from mobile devices. So there's an Ignite client for the iPad. There's an Ignite client for the Android phone and for the iPhone. So you can access those files from anywhere, essentially. So Ignite is really trying to sort of bridge the gap between a local file server that works great in the office and a cloud-based file server that works really well outside of the office and can be, you can collaborate, you can access remotely, you can access from a variety of devices. Great question. Yeah, the question was, does it need to be the Ignite NAS? It does need to be the Netgear Ready NAS. That's the only NAS device that has the software built in that will synchronize with Ignite. And they tend to, we recommend a model that has redundant hard drives, and I think the 1 terabyte model is about $1,000. So it's not an insignificant investment, but it's less expensive than a full-blown server deployment, which could run on the order of $3,000 to $5,000. I see there are a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to kind of continue on for now, and we'll go through and answer the questions at the Q&A period. I'll make sure we leave about 15 to 20 minutes. I want to talk about 2 case studies from some clients of ours. So the first is from Young Playwrights Theater, which is a great nonprofit here in D.C., and they work with young playwrights, generally high school students, who write their own plays, and they help them to get the plays produced so that they're being performed on the stage. And they have about 8 staff, and when we first started working with them, they had sort of that classic environment where they had a server, they had a Microsoft domain, all of their files were stored on the server, and the server was getting old and it needed to be replaced. So the first solution that we recommended to them was, it's not a solution that I've actually mentioned here because we aren't recommending it anymore, but it basically works similar to Dropbox. Software is installed on each of the 8 workstations, and it synchronizes a copy of all of the files in the cloud onto the local machine, much in the same way that Dropbox works, for those of you who are familiar with it. So we migrated them off of their file server onto this solution, and unfortunately it did not work well at all. There were 2 problems, 2 significant problems. One, once all of the, basically that solution was trying to synchronize all of the files that they had in the cloud with each of the 8 workstations. And even though they had a very fast internet connection, it was taking up a lot of bandwidth. That was one of the major problems. And that's one of the advantages of going with something like Ignite, because instead of synchronizing files on every machine in your organization, you're only in your local office, you're synchronizing files just on the NAS, just one set of files. So the bandwidth usage becomes a lot more reasonable. But the second challenge they have is, because part of their mission is to promote the plays that they are helping to put on, they developed a lot of graphical material. And one of their staff was a graphic designer who was using Adobe InDesign all day long. And unfortunately, these very large graphics files that she was working with were just crashing the system that we had put in place, which was like a Dropbox-like system. And it got to the point where her machine was crashing a couple times a week. She really wasn't able to work on any of her files, and it was causing all kinds of headaches. So at the time, we had just heard about Ignite from another nonprofit, one that we don't support, but in the community, in the nonprofit community, we had heard about this other organization that had started using Ignite and had a lot of luck with it. So Young Playwrights Theater agreed to kind of beta test this solution with us, and so we deployed it there over a year ago, and it ended up being the perfect solution for them. They were able to store their large InDesign files on the NAS. They were synced to the cloud and backed up. They were also able to access, all the other people in the organization were able to access their files through the file share on the NAS. But then if they went home or were on the road, they could access the files through the cloud as well. So it ended up being a great solution for them that really met the variety of needs they had around file storage. The other organization I wanted to highlight is the Fulbright Association, which is a nonprofit that we started working with also about a year ago. And when we started working with them, this scenario will probably sound familiar to some of you in the 10 and under sized clients. They didn't have a server, but all of the files were stored on the receptionist's workstation. And so everybody else in the organization would connect over the network to the receptionist's workstation to access their files. And unfortunately, that machine was 5 years old and was really starting to show its age. And there were a lot of concerns around, just the reliability and stability of the files. And then also the staff were starting to work more remotely, and it was impossible for them to get those files outside of the office. So for that, for Fulbright, we actually ended up putting in a NAS-free, if you will, Ignite solution, which they call their personal local cloud. And that actually is very similar to Dropbox, where on each machine, they have 6 staff. On each machine at their office, we installed the software that basically synchronizes a copy of the files. And because of the size of the files and the amount of files, the way in which they were using them, that actually ended up being a very good solution for them as well. And then if they ever grow, they have the option of rolling out a NAS device. So actually, why don't I pause here for about 5 minutes and try to answer some questions before I move on to the next section. Or do you know any, Roshni, off there? If you could.
What collaboration is possible?
Great question. So someone asked what collaboration is possible with Ignite. Ignite has some ability to it does versioning. So if you work on the file, save it, and then someone else opens it and works on it, it'll save multiple versions of the files. So you can go back and get previous versions. But it is not as good a collaboration solution as some of the ones I'm about to talk about next. And actually that's a really good segue for the next and final section of this webinar. So I'll get back to that in just a minute after I answer a few more questions. Great, another great question. What's the downside to Ignite, and are there any limitations on the size of organization that can use it? One of the downsides compared to just storing the files on a workstation is that it will cost more. So while it can, there's a monthly fee associated with Ignite, and it varies based on the size of organization and the number of user licenses that you purchase. In our research, we found that it's actually not that much more expensive than using something like iBackup to just back up your files, and it provides you with all this other functionality as well. So it's not, by any means prohibitively expensive, but if you're currently storing files on a workstation, it will be more expensive, than that. As I mentioned earlier, it's not a collaboration solution, and so that's a limitation to Ignite. And, in some ways, it's trying to straddle sort of an old way of working with files and what may be a new way of working with files, and I'll talk about that in a minute or two. In terms of size limitation, so far we've rolled out Ignite at about half a dozen organizations, and in all cases they were 10 to 11 staff or less. However, there's Ashoka, which is a fairly large international nonprofit here they're based in Virginia. They're in the process of rolling out Ignite around the world, and they have about 100 staff. And we're also in the process of starting to develop and plan out an Ignite deployment for a 80-person organization that has, I think, 10 sites in 5 cities around the U.S. So it's certainly capable of scaling to a larger size. And once we've kind of gone through the pilot, we'll have a blog entry on how that's going. And if you want to come back and check our blog, we'll definitely let you know how Ignite works in kind of those larger, sort of wide area enterprise environments. Great question. Does Ignite include a client? It doesn't. Ignite is dealing, you have to use whatever client is available on the platform to edit the document. So for example, if you're using Ignite on your Windows machine at home, you have to have Office installed to edit the document. If you're using it on your iPad, you need to have some sort of Quick Office or Office Suite Pro installed to edit the documents. The iPad and I think now the Android devices come with a document reader, so you could read the documents, but if you want to edit them, you need to have some other client to do that with. FTP is file transfer protocol, has been around for a long time, and it's basically a protocol for it's one of the original protocols actually for transferring files over the internet. It's still used, I think, particularly in web development. It's probably one of the best ways of uploading and downloading files in the process of developing a website. It is not widely used for, as far as in my experience, not a lot of organizations still use it for active file transfer. Now, Ignite, basically, once you store your files on the Ignite server, you can access them through FTP, and some of these other solutions provide that level of access as well. I'm going to move on, and I'll try to get to additional questions at the end of the webinar. One other thing I will mention about Ignite is that it also uses the WebDAV protocol, which is it's an open standard. It's something that is available on in Microsoft Windows. So if you have from your computer at home, for example, you could set up a map drive that points directly to the Ignite website and access the files directly through that WebDAV protocol. So there's a lot of flexibility with Ignite in terms of how to get to the files. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about kind of approach this problem maybe from a more philosophical standpoint. So I want to ask the question, what are files? This whole time we've been talking about moving files out into the cloud. And I think, email, it's very clear what an email is. It's a very specific type of information. It has recipients, senders, subject, a message body, and oftentimes an attachment, and that's what it is. But when we're talking about files, or maybe even more broadly, when we're talking about documents, we're talking about a wide variety of types of information. When you talk about a document, what could it be? It could be an agenda for a meeting. It could be a letter that you're sending to somebody or some other form of communication. It could be a way of tracking a project. It could be a way of doing calculations. So a lot of you who use Excel, a document becomes something that you're using to calculate or do analysis. It could be what I'm doing right now, which is a presentation. It could be graphic design, and the list goes on and on. I mean, this is just kind of to give you a feel for the wide variety of types of information that we call documents. And so I want to spend about 5 minutes walking through some quotes from a recent interview that I read that really got me thinking about documents and files in a very different way. And these quotes are from Sam Schillis, who was the founder of Writely. I don't know if any of you have heard of Writely, but it was acquired by Google and was basically turned into Google Docs. And that's pretty common. Kind of Google finds really interesting technologies, buys the company, and then sort of incubates it. In some ways, Google is almost a tech incubator as much as it is a large company. So they bought Writely, and Sam Schillis became the lead engineer of Google Docs and sort of saw its development from the very early stages, which many of you may remember, to kind of the full-featured set of software that it is today. And then he left Google Docs recently and became the VP of Engineering at Box, which we'll also talk about in a few minutes. So in this interview with GigaOM, he said that documents used to be more like an artifact. That's how we, historically, that's kind of how we think of documents. They're properly formatted business letters with high latency, so they're around for a long time. High transaction costs, when you think of a formal letter, it costs a lot to create the letter. And it has all this artifice sort of around the structure of a document. So if you send a letter, it has to be on letterhead, properly formatted. And back in the day, it was expensive to create a letter like that. So, sending a letter demonstrated that the person you were sending it to had a lot of value to you. So that's sort of the history of documents in some ways. And we're still, that history is still with us today. But to some degree, we've moved beyond that because we now have the web. And in some ways, the web has reduced the focus on formatting and instead added a more of a collaborative element. And I think all of us, this isn't anything earth-shattering to some degree because we don't draft letters, handwrite them or, type them up and send them to each other anymore. We send emails out, but the nature of communication has changed because of the kind of system that email is. And what Sam Schillis is saying is that because of the web technology, because of the cloud, that's changing how we think of documents. And that's changing how we use documents. He says that with the advent of Evernote and Google Wave, which unfortunately didn't survive, documents have become more abstract. They mix images, text, communications, web pages. So what we've thought of traditionally as a document is changing because the capacity to create a document has changed, and what we can put in a document has changed. So he's trying to get to the heart. In his role as VP of Engineering at Box, he's trying to get to the heart of what's really important. So, what's important? Is it having that Word document, or is it the business interaction or organizational interaction or communication that Word document represents? The point of the document is that you record something for yourself, you record an interaction that you're having with somebody else. And now that we have all these new tools and this new platform and environment, is there a way that we can, change how we think about documents to start, getting down to that raw core of interaction, as he puts it? And I think one of the great examples of this is Google Apps, because Google Apps is a very different way of using and creating documents. Now, Google Apps has all kinds of problems, I would say, challenges, more than I have time to get into in this webinar. That will probably be the topic for a future webinar. I find Google Apps to be incredibly exciting, and I've gone to using it almost completely for sort of all the personal documents or files that I create and work with. And I found that to be the case for a lot of other people as well. We don't really use it here at Citi. We've dabbled in it a little bit, and we're trying to find ways to use it more on an enterprise level, but we haven't fully gotten there yet. But Google Apps is just a completely different way of thinking about your document. So, instead of having a document on a server somewhere that you've created a file structure to store it in, you can create folders in Google Apps, but essentially you're getting to what you need by a variety of different searches. Google Apps has great collaboration tools. You can basically edit a document in real time with dozens of other people. You can have a chat window going. You can all be editing the document at the same time, which creates its own challenges. But Google Apps really represents sort of a different way of thinking about documents and files than what we're used to. And I think there's a lot of potential there, but there's also a lot of challenges for the enterprise. So that organization that I was talking about a few minutes ago, who is going to be rolling out Ignite for the 80 or 90 staff that they have around the country, we had done a sort of a thorough investigation of Google Apps and Google Drive, really, to see if that was going to work for their enterprise-wide file sharing system, and it was just too different. It ended up being just a little bit too much of a departure from how they currently use files, and but they may revisit it, down the road. And I think it's a change that's likely coming. And I think a lot of it's because people are just wedded to this interface, using Microsoft Word. Now, Word is one thing. Clearly, the capabilities of the presentation and spreadsheet software in Google Drive is not nearly as good as it is in the Office suite. So that represents another set of challenges. But I think it points to the future of where sort of document storage is going. It's not just about coming up with how do we take the traditional file server that we've always been comfortable with and working with and move it out into the cloud, but how does the cloud sort of change how we think about and use documents and files? And this is really the direction that Box is going in. And I think I've had trouble, I've been following Box for a while, and I've sort of had trouble getting my head around what exactly it is they're offering. It's a little bit like Dropbox. It's a little bit like SharePoint. It's a little bit like Google Google Apps or Google Drive. But it's also different from all of those. And so Box represents a really interesting departure, I think, from how we traditionally think of files. I have not studied it or used it enough to say any more about it at this time, but I think it's one to keep an eye on in this emerging field of cloud-based file storage. And then also Evernote. It's another example. I've started to read of a lot of individuals, particularly independent consultants, who are starting to use Evernote for pretty much everything they do. Using it as a word processor, using it as a task list or a to-do list, basically using Evernote for almost all of their, what we would have traditionally thought of as file and document storage. And I think it's worth noting that generally when you hear about people using Evernote, it's individuals. And I think Evernote, which has a enterprise offering, I think there's a struggle there to try to figure out how to get Evernote to work in the enterprise and kind of move it beyond sort of a personal productivity tool. And this really leads me to my final slide of the presentation. All of this kind of points back to the era of IT that we are now living in, which is basically the ascent of consumer-driven IT. And this is an infographic that you can download from smartenterpriseexchange.com, which is a website by Computer Associates. The website is devoted to this challenge of basically incorporating consumer-driven IT, things like tablets, advanced smartphones, Evernote, cloud-based file storage like Dropbox. How does all of that make its way into the enterprise so that the technology solutions that we are using at work are as advanced and sophisticated as the ones that we're all now using in our personal lives? And the fact that Computer Associates is devoting a website to this really demonstrates that no one has solved this problem yet. This is going to be sort of the problem in the IT field over the next 5 to 10 years, and it's going to be a challenge. There are going to be a lot of opportunities for nonprofits just as much as there are for the government and for-profit organizations as well. So why don't I take this? We have about 5 minutes left, so I'll try to answer as many questions as I can in those 5 minutes. All right, let's see. So great question. If a small business were starting from scratch, would you not recommend Google Drive and Google Apps? The problems that I mentioned are, kind of the limitations of the presentation and spreadsheet software. And then also I think there's just some security and sharing issues around Google Drive that are sort of hard to figure out in our experience. I think personally, if I were starting my own company right now and I had 1 to 2 staff, I would probably go with Google Drive and Google Apps and find a way to make it work. But I think it kind of depends on the situation. I think it's probably easier for a small organization to start using Google Drives now than it is for an organization that's been using a file server for a long time to make the transition to it. Next question, how do you protect files in a distributed deployment of Ignite? Laptops get stolen with a copy of all the files. This is a great question. I think it's kind of the same problem that you would face right now. In general, in the business environment, staff are going to have files on their local computer. If they're traveling by airplane, they're going to want to be able to work on documents, while they're flying or while they're away from an internet connection. And so basically, Ignite sort of utilizes the same level and type of security that you would use for just normal file storage on a laptop. So you'd want to make sure that it's password protected. If it's very sensitive information, look at encrypting the contents of the hard drive, taking those sorts of precautions. I think the question of how do you protect data on a mobile device gets a little bit trickier because that's a newer scenario. It's a newer environment, and particularly with BYOD, bring your own device being a challenge, that becomes a harder problem to solve. I think right now, and we'll have a BYOD webinar in the coming months to talk about that in more detail. In general, I think you want to look at whatever tools you can find to at least require passwords. I think the two big tools that most network administrators and IT directors have at their disposal right now when it comes to tablets and smartphones is requiring password protection and giving them the ability to do a remote wipe. So if the device gets stolen, you can access it remotely and wipe out the contents. But there are starting to emerge more sophisticated solutions that let you do, a lot more complicated security on those sorts of devices. Let's see. Apologize for the lost audio during the. I think that's it for the questions. Oh, okay, great. Couple new questions just came in. I'm sorry, I missed. Okay, I haven't had any thoughts or experience with BitCasa, so I appreciate that comment, and I'm definitely going to take a closer look at BitCasa. Internet speed up or down for a solution like Dropbox for 40 employees. I would be really nervous about running Dropbox for 40 employees for two reasons. One would be the internet speed connection. I just don't know. I think if you got a 100 meg fiber connection, you might have enough. I mean, if you were able to get, like a guaranteed 20 meg or up fiber connection or Ethernet over copper connection, I might be willing to try it. But I think with 40 staff, that's going to be tough. I think the other bigger challenge, though, with Dropbox is that it doesn't really scale to the enterprise very well, and you run into a lot of problems with how to secure files, share files properly. We had an organization that we worked with 3 or 4 years ago that was using Dropbox in an enterprise fashion, and they were constantly having problems of versions disappearing, files getting deleted. I just think there are a lot of issues around scaling Dropbox to the enterprise that Dropbox itself hasn't worked out yet. That relates to the next question about the user and group level authorization capacity of Ignite, Google Apps, Box, and Dropbox. And I think that refers to security access and controlling permissions over files. Ignite is very similar to sort of a traditional file server, and it's pretty easy to restrict access to folders and files through the Ignite web interface. Google Apps has that ability, although I think one of the challenges I've seen in organizations is it's just very easy to share out files in Google Apps, and before you know it, all kinds of files are all over the place because ultimately it's not really the folder that gets distributed, it's the access to it. And I think Google has some work to do on making that a little bit easier to understand at the network administration level. I'm not familiar enough with Box, and I think Dropbox has had some challenges. Office 365, how does it compare to Ignite and Google? Office 365 is, definitely don't count it out. Office 365 is actually a fantastic solution for hosted Exchange. So if you're looking for email hosted Exchange, you should definitely look at Office 365. It's probably the best solution out there. The file sharing with Office 365 is all through SharePoint. So you're kind of dealing with the SharePoint front end, which requires some planning to put together. They do have a web editor, a web-based editor, that compares roughly with Google Apps. And I think it's still in development, and I'm curious to see kind of where that goes. Yeah. So I apologize, we are at the time limit, and I wanted to thank everyone for their attendance and particularly for your questions, some great questions. I hope you found this webinar informative and interesting. And if you did, we'd like to encourage you to come back next month for Matt Eshelman, who is going to be presenting on smart data backups. Backups are critical, as we all know, and I think that'll be a really interesting presentation. And finally, feel free, if we didn't answer your question or didn't answer it to your satisfaction today, feel free to follow up with us on Twitter. You can send us any tweets that you have, any questions you have by tweeting them to us today. You can reach out to us on our Google Plus page. We're on LinkedIn and Facebook. And tomorrow we'll be launching our new website at communityit.com. And also, finally, if you could just take a few minutes after the webinar to answer a short survey, it really helps us to continue to improve these. We've been doing this webinar series for about a year now, and we do one a month, and we really enjoyed it, and seems like it's been very informative for the community, and we are constantly looking to improve it. So please be sure to fill out that survey. And all of you who attended today or registered for the webinar will get a link to the slides and the recording. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.